This being the first video on this channel, I decided to pick something relatively easy, something not controversial, something everyone can agree on. The death of George Floyd on May 25th, 2020. Now this date I'm sure will go down in history, if not as the day a leftist martyr was wrongfully killed by the police, as the spark that ignited mass rioting and violent protests, headed up by Black Lives Matter and fueled mostly by boredom. History will of course remember 2020 as the year coronavirus supposedly decimated the American landscape, most people being forced to stay home and not leave their homes unless for essential purposes. Now I want to make several points in this video while also keeping it brief, the first of which being George Floyd is being made a martyr, but we all know he was no hero. If you haven't seen it yet, I highly encourage you to go find the since banned YouTube and Twitter Candace Owens video on George Floyd, where she basically dissects the prevailing narrative that George Floyd was a family man, he had a daughter, which of course he did have a daughter, but he was no family man, he had a shady past, and the narrative was that he was on the road to redemption. The narrative also says that he was killed in cold blood by a murderous white supremacist, who was a cog in the machine of the evil police. Now, of course, you know the drill. You've been fed this story for a month by the time I'm uploading this. But what's important for truth seekers to realize is that despite the wall-to-wall coverage of this partially true narrative, two things can be true at once. George Floyd can at once be both an egregious criminal with a history of multiple horrifying crimes, and it be a tragic casualty of excessive police brutality at the same time. The point I'm trying to make is not that his death was unnecessary, but that we as conservatives must make these comments of condemnation of police brutality in context of who George Floyd was. I remember shortly after the news broke on this story, an old friend I know to be left-leaning posted on his own Facebook page a doctored profile of George Floyd's killer, Derek Chauvin, with a white supremacist hat on. Now, needless to say, I didn't hesitate to promptly Google that and found it to be totally fake. Again, needless to say, but I do need to say this. How stupid and self-destructive can the left be? If your message is that police are bad, black people are being hunted because of their skin like alligators in southern Florida, and we have a racist, terrible president in the USA, lying about who the cop was that killed George Floyd is a terrible idea. Never mind that George Floyd was high on fentanyl and crystal meth at the same time when he was killed. I mean, it's not important to the story, right, mainstream media? Well, I'd say it is. Now I make my second point. The left's argument has now become that the police are corrupt and evil to the core, to the root, and they must be abolished. I remember an amazing quote from Milton Friedman. He said it on many occasions, so I won't worry about the exact wording, but it went something like this. Government doesn't have desires, people have desires. And we could extrapolate this to our current dilemma over police. The truth is, the police don't have desires, people have desires. Some of these people happen to be police. Now I realize I'm late to the game on this regard, but doesn't it seem like nobody is defending the police in this case? Has no one thought to perhaps wonder for a split second what might be going on in this police person's head? This individual's head? He is, after all, a human being and not a lifeless badged entity. In his best interest, I think he should himself stay quiet, but conservatives fail to defend this person's humanity in this case. A classic example of ceding an inch only to give up a mile. I mean, look at these riots. Look at the destruction. Look at what's going on in the CHOP or the Chaz in Seattle and the occupation that they've set up there. This is not because George Floyd's death was so heinous and terrible that at all costs people of races other than white need to destroy everything they see. No. These uprisings are happening because, like little children, these activists have finally been told, in the wake of a tragedy, you're right. By everyone. Ask yourself, if we had done our jobs as conservatives and defended to the bitter end the humanity of a person like Derek Chauvin, saying even conciliatory things like, Even though we all think we know what he did was wrong, we have to maintain the rule of law and ensure that Chauvin has a fair trial. If not for that, our entire system of justice falls apart. Have you heard anything like this on TV? No. Because the conservatives in our government, in our affluent institutions, and in our media are all weak. They caved in with their opinions instead of facts because they watched a video on the internet. Remember, two things can be true at once. Derek Chauvin may very well be a murderer, that remains to be seen, and he also deserves a fair trial in court with a judge and a jury of his peers who will examine the evidence objectively and come to a punitive conclusion. Two things can be true at once. Derek Chauvin could have murdered George Floyd, and he still be a human being deserving of dignity and due process. If that's uncomfortable for you to accept, that a murderer deserves fair treatment, if you can't bring yourself to agree with the statement that all men and women are entitled to impartial justice, then I suggest that you aren't acting in good faith. I suggest that you are no better than these radicals burning down buildings and killing innocent people. Point number 3. Be consistent with your arguments. Something that I find hilarious is when someone makes an argument using sound logic, but then later will deny that same logic when it appeals to debunk their argument. You can't have it both ways. Let me show you how the left has been doing this. They claim that all police are bad and that they are irredeemable. Now understand, this is a very stupid argument. I don't agree with it whatsoever. It's also stupid to say all cops are good. There are no bad ones. But somewhere in the middle of these two strawmans, you can arrive at a reasonable and logical, mutually agreed upon point that there are some bad cops, but also some are good. The degree to which you think police are evil and corrupt will vary, of course. I think almost all cops are good, personally. Loyal, honest, positive, racially unbiased humans just trying to do their best. I think some are somewhat positive, but some bad. A smaller number. Maybe they take bribes, maybe they aren't kind, maybe they don't always comport themselves in a manner that is safe for others. And then, of course, there are the bad ones. These are the dregs of the barrel. They're no good. They're vindictive criminals that use their badge as a defense for everything. Now ask yourself, if you said the same thing about civilians as I just said about cops, does the argument still stand? Of course it does. It's a logical argument. Because police are people, it's the same. Almost all people are good, with a few that are somewhat positive, but opportunistic and given the chance, will abuse their position and do horrible things. Finally, there are extremely small numbers, and I mean tiny, that are truly awful people. These are the lowlifes, constantly running in with the law, constantly fighting, hurting, stealing, and breaking. They don't contribute to society, and honestly, they should be in prison, police or civilian, to prevent them from their tendency to hurt others. Ladies and gentlemen, if you are an honest intellectual, you can in no way argue that George Floyd was in Group 1. You may be able to argue he was in Group 2, but I think in a blind test, most of us would put him permanently in Group 3, the worst of the worst. The reason I can say this with confidence is because he was not only accused, but convicted of crimes multiple times that no good person would participate in, and I don't even feel comfortable talking about. A pattern of behavior shows that George Floyd was a terrible person, and to deny this is to deny reality. If you want to argue now that Derek Chauvin is in Group 3 rather than Group 2, please go right ahead. I would most probably agree with you if you made reasonable and rational arguments. Can we all stop pretending for 1 minute that the world was not made a better place when George Floyd left it? Again, two things can be true at once. Everything I've told you here, and that George Floyd did not deserve to die in the way that he did. That's all I have for you today. Make sure to subscribe if you want to see more. Until then, this is Liberty and Freedom Independent News Network, and I will see you in the next video.